Mr. Hamilton has certainly brought up several things. Even in in news reports, Chief McMurray had said that he and his command staff are looking forward to reviewing the recommendations in order to determine how Huntsville Police Department can become an even more better department. So I would like to take this time, if I could, to kind of look at the future, where we are and where we're going. City government, in general, we work to try to improve our departments with innovations such as the City Council office placing meeting agendas and related paperwork on the internet for access to the public. We have C-Click and Fix. It's available also on the internet where citizens can use it to report potholes to the Public Works Department. You can pay your utility bill at with Huntsville Utilities by computer. So these are some of the innovations that we've done in the past, and Chief McMurray about 5 years ago brought up body cameras, which made Huntsville one of the very first cities in the entire state of Alabama to have such an innovation. So we like to look forward and look for innovation in ways that we can make things work a little bit better. We have a good police department. The police department has a strong record of providing especially good protection and assistance to the most vulnerable citizens of our community. The FBI shows that our crime rate statistics are very low compared to other cities with our population. Land-wise, we're the 27th largest city in the entire country for which the police department has to provide coverage and protection for. And there are improvements that we can make within the police department. I think as council members have heard me talk about, I had made contact with different citizens who had come down to speak that had passion about their issues with their positions. And I talked with them, having hour-long telephone conversations with them on a one-on-one basis. There were 8 citizens total. And the idea was to pick up their ideas, ask for their energy, channel it into good ideas. What can we do to make our city's police department even better? There were 4 major categories that things came under. More emphasis on mental health services and training, community outreach, rebuilding community trust, and more aggressive use of the internet. There's some specific recommendations that they were made, and some of these may overlap with what Mr. Hamilton had brought up, so I'll try to run through these. During the hiring process, it was recommended that there be more emphasis placed on the screening of emotional and problem-solving qualities of the applicants. There needs to be an increased need for de-escalation training. It was recommended that police officers be given more downtime with treatment in between when they have to deal with traumatic calls such as murder or child abuse. Appropriate calls should be diverted to mental health and or drug addiction counselors. And I think that, as Mr. Hamilton said, this is something we're going to be hearing a lot about. And this is a good time that we're bringing it up because with the budget for the upcoming fiscal year coming up next September, there's time for planning and studying to see what is going to be needed. There's much community outreach, as Mr. Hamilton had mentioned, that's being done. The Ride with the Cop program has been temporarily put on hold because of the pandemic. That's a great program. Ranger program for teens. Community relations officers work out of each police precinct. There's the Senior Crime Prevention Academy, the interfacing with over 150 community watch chapters. But in some areas of the city, there still seems to be a perception of a lack of positive a positive contact between the police department and the community. Emphasis should be placed on positive contact, and that is something that I think we can work for toward the future. A public information officer would certainly be a very important position to have with this need. Another recommendation that came from one of the citizens who I had discussions with was that in order to encourage public trust that there should be a pro forma evaluation by an outside agency of all current police officers and all future applicants' backgrounds. This could be something similar to the way that the FBI was able to do screening of National Guardsmen at the U.S. Capitol building. Changes should be made in the composition of the Citizens Advisory Committee so that all appointees are made by the elected officials, the mayor and the city council members. A police officer would be appointed by the chief of police to serve as a non-voting liaison between the committee and the police department. The committee would have full authority within city government to audit internal affairs findings, as well as compel the attendance of any police department employee to its meetings. Body cam footage is something that should be released to the public once all relevant court cases and appeals have been completed and with the consent of the affected family members. The use of tear gas should be restricted in the future to only the most extreme circumstances, similar in severity with the attack on the U.S. Capitol building. In the future, citizens who are in violation of protest permits and refuse to disperse after warnings should be arrested. Another recommendation that came was that the internet should be used to post all standard operating procedures and use of force procedures, as Mr. Hamilton had mentioned. There should be an email sign-up list within the police department webpage. This way citizens can sign up to receive media releases, the police chief's weekly communication newsletter that he puts out, and other communications. A recommendation was made that there be a mandate that annual training on use of force policies for officers as part of their required annual Alabama Peace Officer Standards and training continuing education and public archive completion certificates be posted on the internet. The internet should be used to publicly explain the hiring process as it pertains to screening candidates for racial bias. The current psychological screening should be used to screen candidates for racial bias and discriminatory tendencies. It was recommended that there should be a posting on the internet of Huntsville crime mapping data. Post on the HPD website officer complaint information should be made, including the nature of the complaint and the disposition. This would be done in a way that's similar to the disclosing of complaints that are made of public school teachers. There should be on the HPD website the posting of policy as how the police department will screen and handle officers whom are discovered to have exhibited racial bias or discriminatory tendencies. Another recommendation that was made was the use of the Citizens Advisory Committee to review agency standard operating procedures for evidence of bias and over-policing. Their findings should be reported to the public via the internet. The Citizens Advisory Committee's composition, of course, should be diverse in order to provide representation of African Americans, Hispanic, Asians, and Caucasian communities. It should review citizen complaints and make standard operating procedure disciplinary recommendations to the mayor and to the city council. The police department policy manual should be placed on the HPD website, as Mr. Hamilton had mentioned, is already in the process of being done. There should be an internet posting of completion certification for officers' annual training on agency standard operating procedures and the use of force policies. There should be an online complaint form plus an explanation of the submission process for citizens and where to file enforcement complaints. The Independent Citizens Advisory Committee should be utilized to review all citizen complaints that are submitted to the police department. During the protest, a decision was made to use tear gas on the public. The results of that created public outcry and by the nonviolent protesters and members of the general public. It's recommended in the future arrests be made to members of the public when they will not disperse as directed. In short, public trust needs to be restored and better communicated. This is going to be a two-way street. Ideas that would come up would include having stronger emphasis on community outreach and public communication. The public needs to better understand the training and policies that police officers follow. Guidelines for protest and parade permits should be posted on the internet so that way the public can understand their rights as well as their responsibilities, such as being required to stay on sidewalks, the length of the permit, and when they're required to disperse. The internet is a valuable tool that can be utilized in this area. More emphasis should be placed on mental health training and adding specialty personnel to the police department. In short, the police department provides good service to the community, and this is a time, I think we can all agree, when it's a tough time to be a police officer. Just as we've improved the operation and services of other city departments, I think we can all pull together and we can make very positive changes into the police department. And I'm looking forward to working with the mayor and with the fellow council members and the chief on moving forward in these areas.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts, Mr. Kling. Do you have any questions for Mr. Hamilton regarding his presentation?
No.
Thank you. Mr. Meredith, questions for Mr. Hamilton or any thoughts you would like to share?
Thank you, Madam President. I'd like to start my comments by saying thank you very much to the CAC members. You've given a lot of yourselves, your time and talent for almost a year now to bring some answers to the citizens of Huntsville, and we thank you for your commitment. I and the lion's share of District 5 residents that have discussed policing with me since my election actually think that the HPD is doing a commendable job keeping us safe. I want to thank all of the rank and file members of HPD for their service and their professionalism. I am fully aware of two recent incidents involving HPD, one of which has gone viral, that occurred within the 5th District. The events took place in our district, but I'm happy to say HPD's investigation into the case of a young high schooler whose life was cut short way too soon resulted in a very timely arrest of a suspect. And it is my understanding that the officers engaged in the second viral incident have been sanctioned in accordance with HPD policy. Those outcomes go to strengthen the relationship between the HPD and the district residents they serve. In the Northwest, citizens have reached out to me in my office asking for more police presence, particularly patrolling everything from noise complaints to complaints of potential drug dealing. In the Southwest, residents are very pleased with the increase in the number of HPD vehicles that we see traveling Wall Triana, Zert Road, and the neighborhoods that exist within that part of town. And while folks off Capshaw and Old Railroad Bed are not so patiently waiting on the day a police substation finds its way into their community, they are asking for one. So in the 5th District, we like HPD. We want a stronger presence within our district of HPD. And again, I want to thank the chief and his leadership, and most all HPD officers, because you're doing a good job and we appreciate you. I know you don't hear that often, particularly under these circumstances, but we do thank you. All that said, it's very disheartening what happened on those 2 days in June. And it's very frustrating and tiresome for a lot of folks that not necessarily live the events of June 1st and 3rd every day, but have not the best interaction with police, not necessarily HPD specific, but law enforcement in general. And I must say that it's wonderful that we have the CAC and the opportunity for an independent investigation as to what went on. I've already heard some complaints that the administration's presentation was, in certain areas, a far cry from the CAC's report. And it reminds me of what I've heard growing up almost my entire life, that the truth has three sides. And I think what lies before us is the perfect example of the truth having three sides. That said, it is daunting, the fact that no HPD officers stepped forward to be interviewed concerning the CAC's investigation as to the events of June 1st and 3rd. Assuming, as I understand it, and apparently there is some question about this, but departmental permission was granted, and the protections offered by the independent counsel were sufficient with regard to protecting against retaliation and or criminal and civil liability to any participating officers. If that it was in fact accurate, it's disappointing that no HPD officers stepped forward to have their side of what happened documented. One of the most disturbing aspects to me about CAC's report, and they don't say this point blank like I'm going to present it, but it just seems as though HPD lost control of the situation, not on their own accord, but because of the other law enforcement agencies that were brought in to assist HPD. Most of the more offensive activities and actions were actually conducted by law enforcement agents of a different department. And that's a shame. It lends itself in certain circles to be perceived as though HPD either allowed or could not control other agencies from inflicting harm on our citizens. And we should make sure that that perception dies as soon as possible. We have to have interactions and interdependence on other departments. However, I think within the city of Huntsville, we need to establish memorandums of understanding that lay out specifics when it comes to how those other agencies are going to interact with HPD. Frankly, I would like those MOUs to address the fact that within the city limits of Huntsville, HPD is in control. We should not allow other law enforcement agencies to arbitrarily invite other law enforcement agencies into our city without the expressed consent of HPD. It is a fact that the county sheriff is responsible for the courthouse. No one is disputing that. But if actions taken within the courthouse grounds exceed the courthouse grounds, now you're playing into HPD's territory. You can protect that courthouse without shooting a projectile into the city of Huntsville. We cannot allow that sort of action to happen unless it is sanctioned by HPD. Those MOUs should specify that munitions, activities, equipment should all be in compliance with HPD policy, period. There was a clear lack of communication in those over the course of those 2 days or those 2 events. There's been a lot of discussion about the permit and the changes to the permit and when it was issued and when the last change happened. Well, it's a perfect example of why we shouldn't allow changes to the permit, certainly within 24 to 48 hours before the event. It created a level of confusion that was arguably insurmountable and led, one or some could say, directly to the confrontation that happened. When you have protesters or citizens that have an expectation, and then that expectation turns out not to be accurate, it's problematic, especially given the nature, the subject of the demonstrations at hand. There have been some discussion as to whether the LRAD and the bullhorns that police use to communicate with, we'll just call them protesters, were actually efficient, meaning did they work properly? Did the people that were on the street that officers were trying to communicate with to tell to go home, could they actually hear that message? Or was it just garbly-goop? We talk about the undercover officers that were in the crowd, and they did a great job. They found those weapons and they kept us safe. But it would have been nice if they had also been tasked with letting the people on the LRAD and on the bullhorns know that the people in the crowd couldn't hear them. Little things like that, little communication things could go a long way to avoiding the situation that came up. They were already there. We should have expected them to do a little bit more. And I don't mean to fault them. Again, they kept us safe. They took care of their charge. They found those weapons. And I don't mean to attack them or say that they didn't do their job, because they did what they were tasked to do. It just would have been nice if they had added one other responsibility to their charge. I will say that moving forward, we obviously need to look beyond the protests, but I think that there are certain elements that should definitely be addressed in the name of police reform. And I invite all of my colleagues and the administration to reach out to me. I will work with anyone on these issues. I think there should be greater transparency from the HPD to the City Council. I was disappointed. Granted, I have only been serving since November, so anything that happened prior to that I wouldn't have been privy to, but I was shocked at finding out during the CAC presentation that no HPD officers had been interviewed. It would have been nice to know that months ago. Perhaps the council could have done something to aid in getting some officers to come forward. There should also, in my opinion, be some sort of external oversight on HPD. I think that can be accomplished by empowering the Citizens Advisory Council, staffing them up, giving them a budget, and giving them some additional charges so that they can serve that function as an external oversight provider. I think we're going to have to look at qualified immunity. I don't take that lightly. I know what that means to officers. But I think if you do not follow the procedures of the HPD and you violate those policies, then I think some of those protections that are afforded to you should be denied. Again, I know what that means to an officer. The personal liability can go through the roof, but there has to be some mechanism, some insurance provider that can provide sanctuary should you violate a policy and lose that immunity. I can't believe that doctors can get malpractice and athletes can get insurance policies on body parts, but an officer can't get some sort of indemnity for inadvertent errors. We all are human. We all make mistakes. No one, at least I, am not saying that one strike you're out. Everything should be equitable. If your transgression was small and policy says, you should get a slap on the wrist, by golly, take your slap on the wrist, get back out there and serve your community. But if you make a major mistake, and we're hearing about it now, as a particular case is seeing some adjudication, that it's really hard to stare some of my constituents in the face and justify the city absorbing the financial shock that that action has brought onto the larger community. I also believe and think, frankly, that the CAC report underlines the need for a comprehensive body cam, dash cam, drone footage release policy. We brought these things into reality on the basis of being transparent and for officers to have accountability. In order for it to work, the public needs to see that footage. That footage is paid for by citizens and tax dollars. We need to show that when we take money from taxpayers, they are entitled to what we tell them it is for. We can't keep taking taxpayer money and refusing to show the body cam that either will justify police action or give us a starting point to deal with an inefficiency. Again, it could be a slap on the wrist, but we need, as citizens, to be able to see what happened, because as we have seen over the last week or so, there are three sides to truth. That body cam is as close to the middle as we're ever going to get. Now, I know it's problematic. A lot of folks aren't going to want to see what's on that body cam or dash cam or drone footage. It's going to be no fun seeing a loved one get shot. It's not going to be fun for the bystander who gets caught standing directly behind someone that is acted upon by police, and that innocent bystander is just walking down the street. Well, that person's now on body cam. what is that person's right to privacy? When you walk into someone's house as a police officer to deal with a domestic disturbance call, what if the dishes are still in the sink? What if there's garbage strewn around the house because there was a fight there? Are you going to show that sort of thing to the general public? So while I am advocating that we come up with a policy for body cams, it is a very slippery slope. And when we decide, or if we decide to go down that road, we're going to have to understand that you can't unsee what you see. The final thing I'll say is, I think despite any additional cost, we should take a significant and serious look at community policing. I think the police need to know the communities of which they serve. And I think the people that live in those communities need to know the officers that are patrolling and making their neighborhoods safe. It will increase the comfort level of a lot of people of color, that when something happens to them, they're not picking up the phone and calling a dispatcher and not knowing what's going to happen to the person that they suggest made a transgression against them. Right now, I know in the Black community, and I know even more so in the Hispanic community, people are scared to call the police. They do not want to be the reason somebody else winds up dead. If we have community policing and the same law enforcement officers are in that neighborhood and have established relationships with the people in that community, they can go to those officers to report crime and know that that officer knows that Billy and Bob and David are good kids that would never be involved in what has been reported. But they'll also know who is likely to have been engaged in that activity. So I just want to say that HPD, we respect what you do. We know you have a tough job. No one expects you to be perfect all the time. But we need to know that our respect for you is reciprocated by your respect for us. And I'll end on that note. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Mr. Meredith. Mr. Keith.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Madam President. One, I want to say to my colleagues, thank you for being understanding of my lateness today. Thank you to the Mayor as well. Thank you, Madam President, for this meeting. To HBAC, to the young and old heads out there, I'll let you decide who's the young ones. Thank y'all. And it's a blessing, to say the least. And to Colonel Hamilton, as well as the Chief, thank you too. Many people don't know, Chief, we went down to Mobile, had us some okay crawfish not too long ago. We've been dealing with this police reform thing for a couple of years. And I want to say this, because I hope that this is open. Don't feel like I'm going on a monologue. Councilman, if you could jump in, I really want to have a conversation as we work through this. Help me understand. And what it feels like is just a perspective of matter of fact versus matter of perspective. Inherently, I think the public is taking the document and calling it matter of fact. And I think what we just heard from Colonel Hamilton was a matter of perspective. And inherently, we're in the middle, right? The two Venn diagrams, and we find ourselves trying to balance it. I think what we need to start with was, in my assessment, especially on the reason that June 1st and 3rd happened, was that it was the byproduct of a national outcry, which was seen on national television, which was reviewed and has gone through the process itself to find the individual guilty. So I want to say first, if we're going to talk about June 1st and June 3rd, the apology to be accountable to the individuals who were involved. I was there myself saying we can do better. I think we also want to state we never want to have to do this again. So if that's the case, if we want to go through that perspective and say we're accountable for what happened, if this ever happens again, we can do better, that is a success point. I think there's a value in that. But the question then comes back to what I was saying the other day. 363 days of policing, a department that never rests, right? It's all around the clock. I think there's two forms that needs to be considered: accountability and administration. It was stated earlier that there would be 3 new positions, and I think that we've seen a large shift. No matter what, it can't be denied. Chief McMurray has ushered in technology and ushered in a number of things into the police department that have true value, without a doubt. But the question then becomes, if we are trying to support and increase the amount of impact and diversity, and I'm specifically speaking to the socialization perspective, right? Are we equipping the police department to do so?
Elaborate on that, please.
So let's just say it this way. In other police departments, they've pushed the initiative of having individuals who can speak a second language, or 3, incentivizing their pay rate for individuals who can't speak those languages and working on 3rd shift. They've increased the application, trying to get applicants of individuals from the community, incentivizing through a number of ways, not just housing, trying to get individuals who are from the neighborhoods that are being policed. They've incentivized women as well as African Americans as well. And I think in the leadership, we must have some view of it, that we have to increase the support of seeing that level of diversity. Because from the administration, if we just said that Chief McMurray ushered in these things, Colonel stood right there and said these things would have never happened if Chief McMurray was there. What things could happen if another Chief McMurray was there? And I'm not talking about the position of a chief, but in the Department of Policing. Are we empowering people of diversity to have perspectives that have impact that will change the police department? Because none of us went to Chief McMurray and said, hey, we want you to go do CID. He was just as good to know to do it. So what things can we empower some of the administration in the police department or individuals in the police department to put things out there? So then the question then comes, I think something to consider as we continue to go past June 1st and June 3rd is that level of accountability, which I think is important. We keep talking about IA. My problem with the body cam footage and why I believe we should release it, now that this report has come back, is that if we have an investigation of an officer or the actions of an officer, and I'll get to why I think it's a little bit problematic to say, go down there and give a complaint. If we deem that the officer was correct in his action, why don't we publish it? If we believe that the officer did absolutely right, the person came to complain, we are in every way believing that the officer did the right thing, why not publish it to the public and say, here's our example? Because inherently, if the police officer who is reprimanded did wrong, we also now get to say, we do hold people accountable. Now, I'm not talking about every stop. I'm not talking about every pullover. I'm not talking about every stop sign. I'm talking about reviewed complaints, the outcome being published, the reason, and those individuals who agree to it allowing the publishing. Because I'm confident in that level of review, we just saw it. We just had a number of our citizens see body cam footage of an incident that was asked to be reviewed. So you just multiply that times however many people are in the city of Huntsville. Now, they're empowered to give perspective, but the people are empowered to know that their public dollars have some level of accountability. So my view on the body cam footage is that if we are doing right, as some of the reviews come back and say, this police officer, I'll give a quick example. Sent one to Colonel Hamilton. And you guys remember there was somebody in your district who said, I'm calling Devin Keith. Well, I get that call a number of times. Every time I don't send it to the chief or I don't send it to Colonel Hamilton. Sometimes I do, and sometimes I get very involved. There was reprimands for certain actions that the public never heard about. That's a problem. Because how do you know about accountability if you've never told that the people were held accountable? And on the front end, right? If you have individuals who are police officers that know they can get reprimanded behind closed doors, what's the value? Because when we get reprimanded, it's Paul Gaddis, he's writing it right now. We're all accountable at some level and some value, and public scrutiny comes with the position. So inherently, those individuals who are doing right behind the badge, and I'm gonna get to that part, want that. And this is my issue. I could show you in my phone right now 5 different officers that have been to a coffee shop in North Huntsville, who've sat down with me at my house, who have expressed that they don't feel empowered to discuss the issues they have with fellow patrollers. That they are uncomfortable with the conversation, and when giving suggestion, either their senior individual says, don't worry about it, they were waffle. Now, suggestion to do better, how to interact, words you should not use, they were told by senior leadership. And I say senior individuals above them, not the highest level. Individuals above them, that does not pertain to you. And then another individual who has sent in complaints to IA and disagrees with the finding, who says, I can't prove it, but I can give you very specific incidents. And that level of accountability, again, comes back to my perspective. When people say, and I hear this all the time, we want more police in our community. I do too. They forget the other part. We want the best police in our community. It's not carte blanche. Every community and every town hall is going to say, I want more police in my community, but I want the good ones. It's the part that we forget to add. I don't want the bad ones. And the majority of the HPD, especially the ones that I know to be true, just a minute ago, we saw Mike out there throwing a football with a young man. They're great. But what I am telling you is twofold. We have to find administration that sets the example of the change and shift and empower them to make those changes and shifts so that we don't have to keep pushing and curtailing our message through them, because I don't believe, as a legislative branch, that is our job. They do work under the mayor. And the accountability for the first and the third fall on those administrations, and that administration to be accountable to it. We are here to put reform that affects the individuals who get an opportunity. I need to repeat that, who get the opportunity to potentially wear a badge. And now we get to training. This, I hope, is understood. And this is something we argue, I remember, day in and day out in grad school. There are two forms of reform in training. You are telling me that if somebody has been in police force for 17 to 25 years, and I don't mean this by anybody in who has gray hair, but they say you cannot teach an old dog new tricks. I don't care how many 8-hour classes you ask somebody who's been in police, who came into police pre-community police and started in the 80s and the 90s to take an 8-hour class from some young millennial out of California who's wearing a flannel shirt talking about inclusiveness and implicit bias training. You're only going to saturate a brick so much. My argument is that we don't have enough sponges coming into the police department. So if you have two groups, one are individuals who have a large amount of time inside of the police force, have created habitual habits, came in and were taught training by individuals pre-community policing. Now you have the fold of the model of training of individuals coming in. Can you see the tension? The individuals who've been in longer are in higher positions. They act and go about things a certain ways. Some police departments call them cowboys, the list goes on. On the second side, you have younger individuals, and I say younger doesn't specifically mean age, but younger in the police force, who come in with new, fresh ideas. We saw McCarver. They have perspectives about changing policing, still committed to protect and serve, still committed to make that awareness of what they do behind that badge, but also the proactive view that if empowered to do different, public perception can change. And that gets to my third point. When it comes to crime mapping data, when it comes to call to service, one would argue in this 3-precinct that the call to services are about the same. I mean, you can look at the stats and data. The issue becomes, are the reasons of call to service. For the past 4 years, you could overlap the majority of murders, you could overlap the majority of burglaries, you can overlap the majority of domestic violence. You could really hot map those to be in very specific segments of this community. So the complaints inherently might be a little different. And if that overlap of the complaint and interaction correlates directly to certain areas, I'm just saying as a zip code 35810, we should discuss specific interactions in 35810. The likelihood that an individual would have a different interaction has higher value at that point because statistics and data, crime mapping, says you potentially could run in this at a higher reason than what you would if you went up on the ledges for a call. It might be a DUI there, it might be a DV here. Those two call for a different interaction, a high level of customer service, but if that's the case, we go back to training. If you are training individuals to be accountable to a certain place and space, you must be accountable to the community and culture that are there, which is my preference. June 1st and June 3rd were about an African-American and a non-African-American interaction. The frustrations you've seen from people that look just like me and the stories you heard, a lot of them are very true. It was asked, Devin, why do you always bring up that you've been pulled over or you've been detained or you've been in cuffs since you were a councilman? Because I'm trying to tell you, without a doubt, one or two of those times, I might have ran a red light, not every time. I handle myself with comfort because I know most of the individuals behind that badge. And I'll say to you, living in the communities that I moved to, I could particularly understand what attendant 10 might bring. That's not my frustration. Devin Keith's gonna be okay. I absolutely understand who I am when I roll down that window. What bothers me is that a girl who was 17 years old got pulled over right at the corner of the Wabahoe, called me at 7 a.m. before she got to Jemison High School crying, scared out of her mind because she got stopped by a police officer. I immediately got up, I drove, contacted somebody from HPD, and said, I'm just gonna sit on the side. And she's bawling. She's so fearful. No matter if she was speeding, no matter if it was her tail light, she's so fearful. She didn't call her mother, she didn't call anybody else, she called Devin Keith, and I sat there and watched her go through the process. So, the question is two-tiered. Because we can only affect what budget we have and the people who wear our badge. What do we do to empower individuals to erase that fearful interaction? Will it happen overnight? Absolutely not. But that slow erosion is generational. Whether it's throwing a football with a kid, I would argue that it's also identifying people who are liaisons on behalf of the police department, not police officers. It was mentioned about communications. I understand, and I fully believe that you need individuals who stand behind a microphone who understand the booklet, the training, who've been there, who've done that. But I disagree if that's the person that I'm frustrated with that looks just like the individual who I had a frustrating interaction with. I've closed my ears before he started talking. You have to empower and or hire and increase the amount of non-police inside of the police department. And that's my second recommendation, that we do need to empower this group to hire and support a staff or individual who becomes a liaison to efforts to increase and reach out to individuals. It is not anything to me that you want to find people who want to go shopping with a police officer. I will go shopping with anybody if I know I'm getting the right toys and I'm having a good time. I will absolutely sit with the chief if I like coffee. I'm talking about the people who say, I got to call Devin Keith, who gets stopped, who will never, ever interact with a police officer unless it's a really bad day. And you need somebody outside of the police department who has a perspective that is non-biased, that is very specific to community and culture, that empowers that. And I'm not talking about jumping off of Kenny. I'm not talking about somebody that you just call when something goes wrong or when you think they're going to have a bad protest. I'm talking about integrates it every single day. Say, hey, this is an opportunity we might want to get onto. So body cam footage review, good and bad, publicized after review, 30 days with including parties. That is very important and respectful to any police officer. If a police officer has an interaction, it comes out positive, it's reviewed, that police officer might not be comfortable with their face being shown. So having an individual be comfortable with that, I can agree to that. I can understand, because I don't want them doxxed, I don't want them to have fear, and they also might have a wife or a husband or children. But when something as egregious as George Floyd is the byproduct of a cell phone video, or that something of June 1st and June 3rd has a 250-page review where individuals from our community were able to review body cam footage, it is unfair to believe we cannot find body cam footage for the rest of the public to review, good and bad. I would even go further that if you were to sit inside of a training, I get a chance to go there, I don't publicize my first time saying it, I go to see the cadets, I take ice cream, we have conversation for hours, I bring them pizza. Every cadet class, I've been over there, had a simple conversation with the councilman. And all of them want to be better police officers by being better citizens. So much so that the police show bad footage. This is what you should not do. But I bet money none of our citizens have seen that. So empower the HPAC. I look forward to the reforms that Councilwoman Akers have. I agree with you, Councilman Kling and Meredith. We need to hire and increase the diversity through HPAC identifiers that allows an individual to become a liaison for the police, and that liaison can be structured much like a Brenda Martin on specific contract that allows initiatives to be supported specifically from our police force that are positive for the police force as well. I do not want to put any police officer in any unfamiliar, uncertain situation where you push them out in front of a camera and say, go be likable. So we have to value what that is. And then inherently, again, we're going back to accountability, posting those things in review that have true value. And then my final one. We talked about crime mapping, but then my final one, and this is the overall view. And I've said this to the mayor. I actually get a chance to meet with him Friday. I've said this to Colonel Hamilton as well. We can't have an us first them. And it is tough to be in our positions because you do balance knowing how many calls you've made to a CRO and they've answered the call. I would be lying if it wasn't a Captain Rice, Brooks, or somebody who have helped manage situations. Again, I go back to the chief. We went down to Mobile. I came back. We started putting CC television in. Meadow Hills has been different ever since. My fear and frustration is that we're not being honest to the issue having true subjective value, that individuals operate, live, and act differently by the optics by which they see every single day. It was stated by the colonel that in communities of poverty, how do you identify poverty? There's nobody that would be able to tell you how much money they make when you drive down Medeiros. That just happens subjectively. And the colonel is extremely intelligent. The colonel is in every way a great administrator, but he just said it. How do you identify communities of poverty? I would love for anybody to tell me. Is it because there's a majority of African Americans? Is it because somebody didn't cut their grass, or you're in a subjectively viewed neighborhood that doesn't have big houses? There are some pretty wealthy people in Meadow Hills. But then when you drive into a community of poverty, your actions, your views change. And I'm gonna go ahead and say it right here on television. It happens to me as well. Because when I drive up to the ledges, my clothes are ironed. I usually have a haircut, and I probably talk a little bit more proper than this. But we do it. And if somebody who is trained, who has heard the call of being in our military, or is educated in every form and fashion, can make that statement, imagine a police officer who's fresh, who says, I'm in a community of poverty, and I'm called to police this place. How do they act? So, not to take over the conversation, and I mean this in the best way possible, the two things that I really want to get on black and white are a review of body cam footage that is publicized that have true value both ways, that can be used as mechanisms of teaching and learning for police officers and our public. I want to have the ability of review internal to us as the council when it comes to supporting administration, changes in administration, empowering administration to try new things. I want to empower the HPCAC to have hiring power, supportive power to a liaison that supports ideas around the police as it is, again, interlocked with the efforts of the police, because we cannot forget that they still have to answer 911 calls. And then inherently, as we back away from it, be very aware. Slowly but surely, this is not going to happen overnight. We have to review that there is a reality that when you go to a certain place and space in a city, individuals view optically the place and space and determine perspectives, language, and actions because of the things that they view. If you do not believe that not only implicit bias, but optical bias has value, then we should not have this meeting. Because the byproduct of June 1st and June 3rd was an African American with a knee on the back of his neck. Does that mean that individuals who are not African American do not experience situations as such? Absolutely not. Not here to say that at all. But what I am here to say is that the issue that continues to exacerbate itself, our public interactions, much like the one that we saw when she says I have to call my city councilman because the way that you are interacting with me makes me fearful and afraid. And though I have a number of people who are not African American in my community, I've never received a call from them about an interaction with a police officer. That's my time, Madam President.
Thank you, Mr. Keith. Ms. Akridge.
I have a mama said wisdom to offer. You find what you're looking for. Confirmation bias was mentioned, Ms. Hunley, in your report, and it is something that all of us go to this report or through our lives with. I don't know what the answer is to